His Excellency, Dr. Iyasu Abraha, Federal Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Mr. Gabriel Negatu, Director General of the African Development Bank, Eastern Africa, His Excellency Matthias Schauer, German Deputy Ambassador and Chargé d'Affaires, Ms. Rachel Mwikali, representing the youth and women in this meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Janet Edeme, and I'm the head of the Rural Economy Division at the African Union Commission, and I would also be facilitating this opening session. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have come a long way on the road to finding continent-wide solutions to the challenges of land tenure governance and tenure security, which adversely affects efforts towards the socio-economic development of our continent. Africa stands apart from the rest of the world as the only continent that has defined its own agenda for land policy governance and development. These great achievements came out of the work of the Land Policy Initiative, a tripartite consortium comprising the African Union Commission, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the Africa Development Bank. The African Union Declaration on Land Issues and Challenges in Africa was adopted in 2009, calling on African governments, our regional economic communities, and stakeholders to prioritize land policy development and implementation and apply the framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa in their land policy development processes. Since 2009, the continent has not looked back in its efforts to confront land-related challenges at member states, regional, and continental levels. Through the Land Policy Initiative, and in close collaboration with other continental institutions, such as the NEPAD Planning and Coordinating Agency, the Pan-African Parliament, and the Pan-African Farmers Organization, as well as the regional economic communities, member states, civil societies, stakeholders, and partners, we are building consensus, raising awareness, generating evidence, developing capacities, and improving coordination to enhance the implementation of the African Union Declaration on Land, helping to address some of the most daunting challenges. Among the many milestones in this regard is the guiding principles on large-scale land-based investments, which was endorsed by the African Union ministers responsible for agriculture in April 2014. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the drive towards achieving the goals of the African Union Agenda on Land was given additional boost this year when the African Union Specialized Technical Committee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Water, and Environment, at its meeting in October of this year, resolved to establish the African Land Policy Center to provide leadership, coordination, build partnerships, and promote policy advocacy on the continent. The African Land Policy Center, which is the successor of the Land Policy Initiative, will therefore set the agenda on land issues, acting as a repository of knowledge and represent Africa on global platforms. It would also be the driver of continental land policy and advocacy to ensure that land remains a priority in the policy agenda. It would also create linkages and partnerships to bridge the gap in technical assistance and funding, and also create continental and regional land platforms that enhance coordination in the land sector. This is a positive development which will further strengthen land governance on the continent. Our African Union member states have demonstrated the political will and commitment to improve upon the governance of tenure through their commitments to the African Union Declaration on Land. And this commitment will be sustained through the African Land Policy Center and will bring a new impetus to our collaborative efforts and continue to support our member states in the years ahead as we build sustainable institutions, frameworks, and systems to improve land governance on the continent. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the continent has been battling with one key challenge over time, which is meeting the aspirations of the youth and combating the challenges they face. Currently, a large proportion of our youth are involved in self-employment in the informal and agricultural sectors, but they are not fully absorbed in our economies. Rural-urban migration, as well as migration to Europe by our youth, is very high and is expected to reach about 1.2 billion by 2050. For this reason, the theme for this conference has focused on the Africa we want, achieving socioeconomic transformation through inclusive and equitable access to land by the youth. And this theme is aligned with the AU Declaration of 2017 as Africa's Year of Youth as agents for socioeconomic transformation. And this declaration is realized through the theme harnessing Africa's demographic dividend through investment in youth. Africa is the most youthful continent, characterized by 65% of persons between the productive and employable ages of 15 to 35 years. Inclusive participation of the youth in decision-making and empowerment through access to land and other natural resources will unlock Africa's economic potential by harnessing the demographic dividend and provide opportunities for gainful employment. Therefore, enhancing equitable access to land by the youth will significantly contribute towards realization of the Africa we want as envisioned in the African Union Agenda 2063. And this shift ought to be well managed by social and political stability on the continent. With a focus on youth involvement in land matters, governments would have to invest in policy-oriented research to ensure that training and skills are matched with societal needs, especially in enhancing access to land and secure land rights for women and other disadvantaged members of society. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, reforms that put land in the hands of young people and increase their productivity and relevance in society cannot be delayed any further. Tenure security will give the youth confidence and incentivize them to undertake agricultural and allied activities. It will contribute to reduction of youth employment and crime. And this conference is expected to have a catalytic effect on land policy development and implementation in Africa through creating space for presenting research findings on land policy and governance and drawing the attention of African researchers, governments, parliamentarians, civil society, private sector, and our development partners on emerging land issues and challenges that need specific attention in order to achieve the objectives of the Development Agenda 2063. The conference, as a platform for major policy dialogue, information sharing, and learning events, has the overall goal to deepen capacity for land policy development and implementation with specific focus on emerging issues, African Union commitments, opportunities for the youth, improved access to knowledge and information in support of evidence-based land policy making, showcasing promising practices in the field of land policy and governance, and facilitating networking amongst the land actors in Africa. The Commission supports and is pleased to work with its tripartite and other partners to ensure this conference succeeds in availing accurate, objective, and timely knowledge, which is much needed by all stakeholders in the land sector. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, and on behalf of the African Union Commission, I wish to thank all the presenters and speakers in this conference. Your papers were selected from many submissions, and they will help lay the foundation for the success of this conference this year and for many years to come. So let me stop here with a call for a conference that allows open, frank, and fruitful exchange and deliberations. And I thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you. I now wish to give the floor to Ms. Rachel Mwikali, who will be representing the youth and women. Ms. Mwikali, you have the floor.
Representative from the Africa Union Commission, representative from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, representative from the Africa Development Bank, the Deputy Ambassador, national governments present, civil society organization, development partners, the academia, private sector, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rachel Mwikali. I come from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm the convener of Coalition for Grassroots Human Rights Defender. I'm also a proud, happy African feminist. It gives me great pleasure and humility to share this platform with all of you and to make note address on behalf of the youth and women of this great continent. This year, the African Union picked the theme, harnessing the demographic dividends through investment in the youth. This is acknowledging the central, often ignored role of youth in defining the development agenda in the continent. Indeed, achieving socioeconomic transformation must be inclusive and must ensure that young women and young men have secure land rights. The number of young people aged 15 to 24 years is expected to increase to 1.3 billion by 2050. Most will be born in developing countries in Africa and in Asia, where more than half of the population still live in rural areas and also in informal settlement. This is according also to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA Report 2011. Unfortunately, despite this reality, young women and young men have limited access to land, which is fundamental for sustainable agriculture, the backbone of our economy. Inheritance laws and custom in some of our countries make the transfer of land to young women more problematic. Young women and men have limited access to markets. It is difficult for them to engage in viable and sustainable agricultural ventures. Access to market for young women and men is becoming even more difficult due to the growing international influence and the vigorous standards within supply chain. Young women, especially in the rural areas in this continent, face additional constraints due to retrogressive culture, norms, and practice. I say retrogressive because I know that there are some progressive culture and norms and practices in this continent. Too often, young people's voices are not heard during the policy process and implementation. And so their complex and multifaceted needs are not addressed in these processes. Policy often fail to account for the diversity of young women and men, and so do not provide them with necessary and effective support. Young women and men have sufficient access to information, insufficient access to information. This is critical and urgent need to improve young rural women access to education and to incorporate agricultural skills and also adding value addition in the agricultural practice they are doing. How are we packaging our reports, research, to appeal to the young women and men, and encourage dialogue in addressing the numerous challenges related access and control of land for young women and men? Addressing the land issue among young women and men encourages them to be involved in agriculture and ultimately addressing the significant untapped potential of this sizable and growing demographic. Improving access to information and participatory research, which is also key important, will facilitate youth access to markets within the inch market, offering significant opportunity for the young peasant farmers in the continent. Deliberate effort must be made to ensure that the voice of young women and men are heard in all policy discussions and also implementation. Policymakers themselves must also actively engage both youth, which comprises young women and young men, and also grassroots women, who are also primary stakeholders in the policy-making processes. With these few remarks, I welcome you all to this great conference, a space that is safe for genuine critical conversation, engagement, constructive feedback on what we must do in realization of the Agenda 2063 and what we must do to follow. And I request, with the love we have for the continent, please can we stand up? We do the Africa Moja, Africa Uru. Please. So we hold our hand like this on the left side. When I say Africa Moja, you say Africa Uru, meaning one Africa, free Africa. Africa Moja, Africa I cannot feel you, depending with the theme. Africa Moja, Africa Uru. Africa Uru. Africa Moja. Thank you so much.
Ms. Mwikwali, for those remarks. Now, it's my honor and privilege to give the floor now to His Excellency, Mr. Matthias Schauer, German Deputy Ambassador and Chargé d'Affaires. Mr. Schauer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janet Ndeme. Your Excellency, Dr. Iyasu Abaraha, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, Mr. Gabriel Negatu, and Ms. Rachel Mwikwali. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the African Union, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Land Policy Initiative for organizing and hosting this important second African Conference on Land Policy. Today, I'm not only representing the Federal Republic of Germany, but also speaking on behalf of the European Union and Switzerland. All three support the Land Policy Initiative and sustainable land governance on the African continent significantly. As we saw in the video introduction, land is an essential topic, not only for development. The overarching topic of the conference is, quote, "The Africa we want, achieving socio-economic transformation through inclusive and equitable access to land by the youth," end of quote. This is a rather lengthy title, but it captures two of the most challenging and most promising topics on this continent: youth and land access. I would like to start with youth. Today, there are more than 1.2 billion young people in the world. Never before has there been such a large number. Africa is the youngest continent of the world. More than 70% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is younger than 30 years. When you come from Europe and enter an African country, what strikes you most is the vast number of young people. This is an enormous potential. The AU has organized a conference on skills and employment just 2 weeks ago, and I very well remember two people from that conference. One is a young lady from Nigeria who had set up her own business. She and her team are teaching disadvantaged young people in soft skills to improve their employability. This young lady was very charismatic and full of energy, really impressive, a true role model. On the other hand, on the same conference, a young man from Burkina Faso raised a very challenging question. Why are we, as young people, excluded from political and economic power? Why are especially young people unemployed? And why is our voice neglected? There are many answers to these questions, from a political, historical, sociological, economic angle. Today's conference addresses one answer to this difficult question, and that is inclusive and equitable access to land. Access to land can be one solution to the pressing demands of a young and growing continent. Access to land means access to production facilities. Access to land means economic empowerment. Access to land, that may sound quite easy, but it is in fact extremely difficult to implement. From our European experience, we know that access to land has been the cause for wars, for civil wars, and has been one of the reasons for the strong rural support of the Russian October Revolution 100 years ago. As a consequence of this revolution, and in an attempt, understandable attempt, to distribute land evenly among the population of the aristocratic land-owning elite was expropriated. Every kind of private ownership of land was banned. This concept was exported to other communist countries after World War II, for instance, to Eastern Germany. In Eastern Germany, this model was forced upon the population against its will, its traditions, and caused long-lasting negative economic impact. In fact, it can still be held accountable for some of the problems that are still prevalent in East Germany today. This historic example shows the devastating consequence of land reforms which do not take into account traditions, culture, and economic preconditions. They have also neglected one of the most important realities. You need incentives to cultivate land. Would you, personally, be willing to invest into a piece of land, not knowing if the profit will be yours? Would you build, for instance, a factory on a piece of land, running the risk that others may claim this piece of land later on? And why would you put in an extra effort to develop land that is not yours and that you will not be able to pass on to your children and grandchildren? This example shows from our own history what it is all about. Investment requires clarity and reliability. Without clear ownership and responsibility, there is no investment. Forget about it. Without it, there can be no positive incentives for land use. Access to land involves a great number of actors and very conflicting interests. But sustainable access to land is also the solution for pressing development problems. To come up with tailor-made approaches for each specific situation on the continent is one of the targets of our development programs. Germany supports the establishment of scientific hubs, centers of excellence, in all 5 African regions. These centers are in Morocco, Ghana, Cameroon, Tanzania, and Namibia. They fulfill the following functions: improving research, knowledge, and data exchange on land governance on the one hand, and bridging the gap between research and science and policy making on the other hand. With this support, we aim to strengthen the implementation of the AU agenda on land, which is the ultimate aim to come to durable solutions for access to land and land tenure. To conclude, I would like to quote from the Kagame report, which has been approved by the heads of state and government in January 2017. Quote, "Tens of thousands of young African bodies have been swallowed by the sea or abandoned in the desert in pursuit of a decent life, for which they are prepared to risk everything because they believe there is no hope at home. They testify to the urgent need to act. Continuing to defer reforms to the future is an implicit decision to do nothing. It means giving up on ourselves, our people, tolerating our conditions as inevitable, and accepting of Africa's subordinate place in the community of nations as natural." Unquote. I find these are very harsh and sobering words. But this conference, with the AU agenda on land, shows that many on this continent are not willing to accept these conditions as inevitable. Therefore, I congratulate UNECA, LPI, and AUC for convening this conference, and I encourage each and every one of you to come up with creative, convincing solutions and strengthen partnerships to offer the young and creative African population the perspectives for a decent life here on this continent. Germany, the EU, and Switzerland are ready to support you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. Matthias Schauer. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Gabriel Negatu, the Director General of the African Development Bank, Eastern Africa.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Dr. Yasu Abraha, Dr. Abdullah Hamdouk, Dr. Janet Edema, and all the colleagues on the podium. And dear colleagues, good afternoon. My name is Gabriel Negatu. I'm the Director General of the African Development Bank in the East Africa region. And on behalf of the African Development Bank and its President, Dr. Addis, who unfortunately is not able to join us this afternoon, I wish to convey our sincere gratitude and appreciation to the AUC and the UNECA, and most particularly to the Land Policy Initiative for the timely organization of this important conference. The event comes at a time when Africa is experiencing an increased flow of large-scale land-based investments and challenges of youth unemployment increasing in equal measures. As many of you may know, the African Development Bank in 2013 approved its 10-year strategy for the period 2013 to 2022. The bank strategy figures two key and interrelated pillars: inclusive growth and the gradual transition to green growth in Africa. When Dr. Addis was elected president of the bank group, he further strengthened the 10-year strategy by identifying and setting 5 key accelerators of Africa's transformation, commonly referred to as the high fives. And these are feeding Africa, industrializing Africa, powering and lighting up Africa, integrating Africa, and the last one, improving the lives of the people of Africa. These are collectively known as the high fives. The 10-year strategy and the high fives recognize natural resources, land included, as the propeller of economic growth in this continent. Moreover, the bank also recognizes that without proper governance of natural resources, it remains extremely difficult for African governments to achieve sustainable and equitable development. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the crafting of sustainable and equitable land policy, which you are all here gathered to discuss, appeals to several interrelated goals, including natural resource governance, conflict management, sustainable economic growth, poverty alleviation, and good environmental management. These are all linked into what is an equitable and sustainable policy. Hence, to ensure that over the next 3 days, your deliberations will produce something concrete, and to ensure there is a takeaway. After 3 days of deliberation, the African Development Bank wants to share a few perspectives. And there are four important elements that we would like to see this August Assembly duly interrogate and address during the course of the next days as you deliberate, and that we hope that at a later date, we at the African Development Bank will be able to draw from these takeaways from this conference as we proceed to implement the high fives that I just pointed out. And let me go through them very quickly. First, land in Africa is not simply an economic or an environmental asset. It is not. It is equally a social and cultural resource. Land is a major factor in the definition of social and political identity. The organization of communal and religious lives, and the production and reproduction of culture, class, gender, religion, ethnicity, and nationality. Land is at the center of all this. It's the organizing principle for many of these. Thus, generation-old cleavages and related conflicts shape access to, control, and utilization of land, resulting in a complex basis of claims and counterclaims over land resources. These are key attributes which the development of a national land policy must address if current development trends are to be sustained and to remain equitable. Second, the second point we wish to put out is that as we gather to deliberate the question of land policy in Africa, we do so in an environment where, in spite of extensive dependence on farming as a way of life for most Africans, not all of the continent's land are arable or even potentially arable. Large parts of this continent are desert or semi-desert and facing severe ecological damages. In many instances, unequal distribution of land has relegated a growing population of small farmers onto marginal areas, leading to increased pressure on land and land resource degradation, such as deforestation, flooding, and in some cases, soil exhaustion. This natural calamity is further exacerbated by emerging global trends of large-scale land invasion for mining, energy production, agriculture development, etc., etc. Perhaps many of you around this room know this much better than I. However, the new realities of large-scale agriculture, land-based investments, and cases of land grabbing in some instances all give rise to legal complexities that must seek remedies to matters of land tenure, land use, land management, and dare I say, environmental governance. Therefore, the policy challenge that we are gathered to address is that of arbitrating equitable and sustainable investment in the land sector without depriving citizens of this most valuable resource, land, and the giver of life in the majority of African countries. Thirdly, despite the reverence which surrounds land and land relations in Africa, the system of patriarchy The system of patriarchy has colluded with law to discriminate against women and youth on matters of land ownership and control of land-based resources. In this regard, I welcome the comment of Rachel, the representative of the youth, who articulated it better than any of us could. Thank you, Rachel. Nashakuru sana. Well done. Huh? This practice of subjugation of women and youth on land matters has been reinforced by imported land laws that further cement the patriarchy status quo in favor of biased inheritance rights. Thus, if laws and policies are to ever redress gender-based injustice in land use and holding, it is imperative for us to re-examine and restructure existing property right laws, covering land both under customary and statutory law. And this must be done in a manner that anchors women's and youth's access and control of land, and must be enshrined in law and institutions. This perhaps is more ironic in an environment such as Africa, where women remain the primary users of agricultural land. Fourth and finally, a number of changes in the global environment, politics and economy are beginning to exert new and alarming pressures on Africa's land resources. The most visible of these are in response to changes in the global ecosystem, the insatiable demand for energy, food, and water supplies. Therefore, a key challenge for African policymakers will be to put in place equitable policies that ensure the risks associated with these changes, and in particular, the risk of uncompensated loss of land or undercompensated loss of land and land rights by the poor are mitigated or effectively managed. Let me just put a caveat here. I'm a great believer in the promotion of the private sector into the agriculture and land use sector. However, the challenge for policymakers going forward is to ensure that those that are on marginalized lands, those that become marginalized, are adequately compensated and catered for in that process. Distinguished guests, in recognition of the importance of natural resources for Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank has set up a new department called the African Natural Resources Center. One of the key focus areas of the center is land governance. Through the center, the bank will continue collaborating with the AUC, the UNECA, through our current joint initiative, the Land Policy Initiative, that has also transformed to be known as the Africa Land Policy Center. We shall do so to ensure that land plays its rightful role in the development of African economies, and more particularly in enhancing economic opportunities for women and youth, equitable property rights, strengthen land governance, and so on. The changing role of land, both as an economic asset as well as a resource for social identity, is not lost to all present here today. Hence, the African Development Bank shall continue to help African governments to develop land policy processes that duly recognize the role of land and community-based land administration and management institutions and structures. I wish to further reiterate that the bank is prepared to work with partner institutions and African governments to ensure that land governance and land policy processes in Africa are transparent, easily understood, and accessed, and to ensure there is interface between state and indigenous systems, particularly with regards to the certification of land rights, the empowerment of decentralized institutions, and the management of land and resources at the local level. I wish to conclude by emphasizing that a strong and efficient land policy regime in Africa is an idea whose time has come. It's an idea whose time has come. The case for such a policy is strong, and the time to act is now. We at the African Development Bank, through the high fives and other initiatives, are ready to play a constructive role in this process alongside with other partner institutions. With this, I once again thank the organizers of the Land Policy Center for this timely event, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gabriel Negatu, for also sharing with us some of the perspectives of the African Development Bank and some of the takeaway messages you would want to be going back with. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. Hamdok.
Good afternoon, Excellency Dr. Iyasu Abraha, Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Sir Gabriel Negatu, Director General, East Africa Region of the African Development Bank, Dr. Janet Edim from the African Union Commission, Mr. Matthias Skuya, Deputy Ambassador from the German Embassy in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Ms. Rachel Mweni, representing the youth and women, Excellencies, Ministers, Ambassadors, Head of Mission, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to the Conference on Land Policy, which has been organized jointly by the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, and the Economic Commission for Africa, under the coordination of the African Land Policy Center. Let me express my gratitude to the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia for the generosity and hospitality accorded to the organizers and the participants of this conference. Of course, for us as ECA, this is our headquarters, and we continued over the years to enjoy the hospitality and the hosting of this generous nation. The theme of the conference, the Africa we want, achieving socio-economic transformation through inclusive and equitable access to land by the youth, is very appropriate at this time, just echoing the sentiment expressed by both the Deputy Ambassador and Gabriel Negatu from the bank. It addresses an important concern related to the realization of the African Union Agenda 2063, but also the Global Agenda 2030. There is no doubt that the land is central to livelihoods and sustainable development. It forms the basis for agriculture, forestry, mining, industry, tourism, and urban development. But to maximize on the benefits of land and its resources, inclusion of land users in decision-making on how land is governed and managed is crucial. Equitable access and utilization of land and its resources is vital for sustainable economic growth, increase agricultural productivity, and the development of a robust agribusiness on the continent. I think you all agree with me that the outdated manual hoes and the way we produce in our land, we should really rest it to the dustbin of history. We have to increase the productivity and the production of our land. This conference is taking place at a time when the continent is experiencing an economic and social reawakening, notwithstanding the effect of climate change and other calamities and risks and all that. Africa is in a hopeful state, not only because of its youthfulness, but also due to the widespread discovery of land-based resources. The 420 million young people aged between 15 and 35 years can be gainfully involved in the exploitation of these resources, especially through agriculture, manufacturing, and industrial sectors. Their creativity and ability to seize opportunities provided by the technology can be turned to advantage through rigorous design of income-generating programs based on land. I think it is high time to create the opportunity for our young talent and our future to be retained in the continent rather than seeing them dying trying to cross the Mediterranean and others. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Africa is home to abundant natural resources, accounting for at least 30% of the world's natural resource wealth, currently 12% of oil reserves in the world, 40% of global gold reserves, and 60% of uncultivated land are all in Africa. The continent has 70%, just to mention this precious metal coltan, deposits from which electronic microchips are made. If these resources are put to good use, they can secure livelihoods, reduce land-related conflicts, and transform lives. After a sharp drop in economic growth to 1.6%, of course, we're all disappointed about that dip around 2015, 2016, after the very optimistic period of the Africa Rising narrative and all that started from the dawn of this century. But I think the good news, Africa is rebounding. In 2017, with growth rate at about 3.1% due to slight increase in commodity prices and strong growth in domestic demand. 14 African countries had an impressive performance of growing at 5% and above. All African countries except 8 economies registered growth rate of 3% and above. Oil importing countries led the continent growth among economic groupings, reflecting the move towards more diversification and increased public investment, especially in infrastructure, improved macroeconomic policy management through fiscal consolidation and prudent monetary policies, also guided government expenditure and maintained economic stability in most of our countries. Of course, medium-term prospects for the continent remain positive. However, this positive growth outlook will depend on the stability and the ability to mitigate several internal and external risks and uncertainties. Slow growth recovery in the advanced and emerging economies, and tightening fiscal markets, high fiscal deficits, and weather-related shocks remain a threat to the continent's medium-term growth prospects. Of course, there are a number of uncertainties in the world today, protectionism in some parts, the challenges around Brexit and others. In order to maintain and enhance the current growth prospects, African countries need to focus on medium and long-term strategies to attract private investment and build infrastructure to boost productivity and competitiveness of their economy, for which agriculture represents the backbone of these economies. This gives us reason to be optimistic, especially if Africa seizes the opportunity to invest in its land through strategies and interventions that focus on the bulk of the continent population, the youth. Industrialization provides a viable solution to the diversification of our economies and expanding employment opportunities for the youth. At the center of the industrialization agenda should be the conscious involvement of the continent researchers, yourselves, professionals, and communities, so that development strategies are driven by evidence and knowledge. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, the EU Declaration on Land Issues and Challenges emphasizes knowledge generation, dissemination, and learning as key to improving land governance. When researchers, policymakers, and land professionals converge to share experiences, they are able to come up with viable policy, programmatic solutions to the challenges of land governance. The decision to adopt a scientific approach at this conference is appropriate because it provides participants with the opportunity to link research findings and policy-making processes with the land sector. At the ECA, we recognize the value of evidence-based policy formulation and implementation processes. We have an opportunity to propel the continent forward through strategic reforms in land governance policies. The African Land Policy Center has developed a number of tools that can be used in this regard. The promotion and protection of land and the property rights of marginalized communities, including women and youth, and pastoralists, is particularly important. Equally sustainable land use planning and management, documentation and digitization of records, developing the capacity of land professionals to cater for current and emerging societal needs, and utilization of technology for improved agricultural production are a few of the measures that ought to be undertaken. Africa ought to see land as a major resource to enhance food security, address peace and security challenges, and ensure environmental protection. By developing inclusive land policies, we create an opportunity to invest while simultaneously protecting the interests of the African people. Also, globalization patterns provide an opportunity as well as a challenge for the continent. We all know the land grabbing and all this. With national and global investors developing growing interest on land and its resources, we must ensure that investment activities are aligned to the needs of the African people. Luckily, the guidelines on large-scale land-based investment in Africa provide an opportunity for the continent to promote investment in a reasonable and responsible and sustainable manner. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me assure you that ECA is committed to contributing to the implementation of the EU agenda on land, as demonstrated by our support through the hosting of the Land Policy Initiative for 11 years, and now hosting of the Africa Land Policy Center. We commit to provide support to the EU agenda on land, including hosting the Africa Land Policy Center, and continuing to support this land policy conference, and we hope to have it an annual event that provides an opportunity for you to get together on that. Let me end by welcoming all of you to take advantage of this important platform to form long-lasting networks and partnerships in support of Africa's economic and social transformation. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamdok, and thank you for the reassurance with regards to continuing the hosting of the Land Policy Initiative as it transitions to the Africa Land Policy Center. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege now to invite His Excellency Dr. Iyasu Abraha, the Federal Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, to present us with his keynote speech and officially open the conference.
Janet Edame, representative of the Africa Union Commission, Your Excellency Dr. Abdullah Hamadok, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Rachel Maukali, representative of the Youth and Women in Africa, Dr. Gabriel Nigatu, Director General, Africa Developmental Bank, Matthias Scheuer, Germany Deputy Ambassador, members of diplomatic community, representatives of the international organizations, distinguished delegates and participants, ladies and gentlemen. On the behalf of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia government, the Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and myself, I would like to welcome you all to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, during this beautiful month of the year where you can see green wherever you go. I am also pleased to welcome you to the second biennial conference on the land policy in Africa, and the agenda we have to understand the theme of the Africa we want, achieving the socio-economic transformation through the inclusive and equitable access to land by the youth. I would like to congratulate all of you who have worked hard to make this second continental conference happen. The conference will create a window of opportunity to discuss and share our country's experiences and land governances and the related thematic areas which are part and parcel of the evidence-based policy making process in Africa. I congratulate the organizers and the role of the played by the land policy initiatives, now the Land Policy Center and its partner in bringing us to this point for their efforts to help Regional Economic Commission and the member states to develop a comprehensive land policies and strategies which promote sustainable and inclusive agricultural development. Ladies and gentlemen, as you all know, land is one of the major resources we have in Africa that should be properly managed and used for the benefit of current and future generations of our people. As agriculture, the mainstay of the majority of the population of the Africa and its future development is heavily dependent on designing and implementation of the appropriate land policy, land use plans and integrated natural resource management systems. Effective and land policy with appropriate implementation mechanisms promote secure, equitable access to land by array of the beneficiaries, including smallholder, pastoralists, and agro-pastoralists, women stimulating economic development. Looking back to our African countries' history, the land rights regime varies from country to country that affect the land use types and ownership rights. The inappropriate land use and the misuse of our land resources have aggravated the land and soil degradation, resulting in disappearance of our biodiversity, resources, deforestation, and extreme climate change that cause drought and floods. This mismanagement of our natural resource and the low level of appropriate technology applications in our farming system in Africa have contributed to the low level of agricultural productivity and production, which led our countries to poverty, food insecurity, and at times famine. This situation needs to be reversed. Africa has to be in a position to sustainably use its natural resource for the benefit of its population. We all are now new to land-related challenges. We know them well, but we need to join hands to overcome our land degradation and policy challenges in a smart way through the implementation of the African Declaration of the Land according to the framework and guidelines and other important global regional frameworks and land tools. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia is committed to implementation of the African Union Declaration and land the Maputo Declaration of the CAADP commitments. Our country is among many countries that signed the CAADP Compact and mainstreamed land governance in its program and strategy, which was reflected in its national agricultural investment plans. Moreover, realizing the importance of the National Land Use Plan, Ethiopia has embarked on designing roadmap in developing the National Integrated Land Use Plan, which is currently coordinated under the Prime Minister's Office. Another area of the achievement of political commitment of the Ethiopian government to put in the place an effective land administration and certification system in rural and urban areas. To this effect, we have a number of projects undergoing implementation which are supported by our developmental partners. Regional governments are responsible to administrate the land in decentralized and participatory manners. Therefore, we are also open for dialogue based on the facts on the ground and recommendation of different studies, use of them as an input for our strategy formulation process as we are preparing for the next generation for the growth transformation plan, GTP3. As rightly identified, the confidence thematic focus on use, agriculture and land leases are emerging challenges to most African countries that our head of states needs to be informed and be aware of through the knowledge generation and outreach process to take policy programs and actions. Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I wish you all success deliberation in coming 3 days of the conference and benefit from the knowledge generated and shared benefit practices. Let us strive to join strengthening the African-owned land policy platform through strengthening the African Land Policy Center, which is recently launched and institutionalized under the leadership of the 3 African institutions, OUC, ECA, and FDB. Finally, let me declare that the African Land Policy Conference is officially open. I wish you all a pleasant, enjoyable stay in Addis Ababa, and I thank you.